CrisisIbility, Episode 6. As a society, we've hit a major roadblock. The question is, how are we going to navigate to overcome the crises that stand before us? 4 of us have come together to explore this. This includes myself, Alan Fine, founder and CEO of Elluette GBC, Devry Boughner Vorwerk, founder and CEO of Devry BV Sustainable Strategies, Steve Young, Global Executive Director of the Cow Roundtable for Moral Capitalism, and Michael Wright, founder and CEO of Intercepting Horizons. Welcome to crisisIbility, where we seek conversations to transcend crises with possibilities.
Well, welcome again to our podcast with the 4 of us, Alan Fine, Devry Boughner Vorwerk, Michael Wright, and myself. Today we have as a guest Jean Rognetta from Paris, and Jean has been a friend and colleague of mine at the Cow Roundtable for a number of years. He has a dual backgrounds, if you will. One as a journalist, and secondly as a spokesperson for and patron of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. Jean is the president of Euro Entrepreneurs. And Jean, maybe I could start with a question for you from your vantage point in Paris, which sort of went into France under President Macron, went into lockdown before we did in the United States. And the Americans, I think every American today, even those who were born in the Depression and remember World War II, what we're experiencing now is absolutely unprecedented in our culture, in our history. And one of the questions is whether the psychology of Americans is sort of up to dealing with the crisis. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, sort of comparing the French reaction to what's going on and the American reaction.
Well, first, I would like to thank you for inviting me on this podcast. And my first reaction would be rather on politics than psychology, shall we say, or mass psychology. I would hardly venture analyzing American psychology. What struck me is the learning lag. In Europe, France is about 1 week behind Italy and Britain about 2 weeks. The curves otherwise are strikingly similar. So far, nothing can allow us to think that France next week is not going to be in the situation of Italy today and Britain in a fortnight. And well, Britain has had its own political process and declared lockdown and is starting in the lockdown process just today. I believe the Boris Johnson speech was yesterday. France had the same political infusion time. What was happening in Italy, we watched as if it could not happen here, which, as I remember, is a title of an American book on another subject. But not so different a subject. I'll come to that eventually. This learning lag is absurd in countries as close as European countries. As of today, to my knowledge, Germany is not locked down, Switzerland is not locked down, Britain is not yet locked down. And this... Okay, well, is it okay?
Yeah. Now you're back. Yeah, now you're back. Yeah, no problem.
My computer seems to keep going on mute. I apologize for that. I'll keep an eye on it.
You sure, Jean, it's your computer and not somebody controlling your computer?
Now that is an open question. That is the second question which I'll put to you. But the first question is, the first reaction seems to be closing borders. Whereas, in fact, the first reaction should be learning from abroad and fast. Had Europe watched China and Korea and Japan much more closely and learned faster, there would be considerably fewer deaths. And I believe this applies also pari passu to America.
So excuse me, Jean, for interrupting, but it strikes me that what you've just said fits exactly Devry's instinct. What I think what you're saying is the possibilities you need to find in this crisis is to reach out and learn as much as you can, as fast as you can. That's the best response. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I believe the first lesson of the crisis is learn from abroad, and do not think that closing borders is in any way a solution.
No, Gene, yesterday, Donald Trump had a press conference late yesterday afternoon talking about opening up the U.S. in about a week.
Yes, well.
And we noticed that Dr. Fauci was not present, who's helping us to better understand the scope and challenge that we're facing. What do you think about that?
I think closing borders was too late in the first day, and opening borders will probably not change anything. Going out of lockdown, on the other hand, is a particular quirk of the American mind, if I can misquote what you just said, Steve. We are quite stricken by the American acceptance of inequality confronted with illness and death. The reason why European countries, even Britain, though Britain has last, are going or have gone into lockdown, is to try to give everybody.
Sorry, Gene, we just lost you. Gene, hold on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to start again on this point?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Closing borders was always too late. On the first day, even if it had been done the first day, viruses know no borders. So I believe that closing borders was useless, and opening them again will have no effect. What will have an effect, and a potentially destructive effect, is getting the country out of lockdown way before the epidemics have the virus has peaked. It just seems to have peaked in Italy the day before yesterday. Hopefully it has. This means that after 2 or 3 more weeks of lockdown, the pandemic will possibly be under control in Italy if it doesn't start again in southern Italy. Getting a country out of lockdown today, well, it's not for me to judge the decision, but it seems to derive from an American and possibly British as well, higher acceptance of inequality in front of life and death issues such as the coronavirus. The fact that the British government and the American, or at least the American administration, contemplated managing the death rate and building herd immunity directly advocates a form of social Darwinism, in which the poor and the old die and the young and the fit thrive, which to European, or at least continental European ears, is downright unacceptable. Our solution is to keep everybody in lockdown and lock up the people that don't respect the lockdown, so everybody gets a chance to come out of it, and we'll come out of it together.
Michael?
I think you're touching on a really interesting ethical dilemma and also a cultural dilemma. If you look at the Asian countries where age is respected, the response is quite different. An example country is possibly Taiwan, who in December, because of their prior experience with SARS, was checking people on airplanes coming in from China and really contained it very quickly, shut everything down. They have 124 protocols that they follow that were developed after SARS. But I think to your point, the inequality piece, the cultural, I wouldn't call it disrespect for age, but in some cases, the sort of the, well, this is a boomer problem type of mindset in the US. The other is that Washington is one of the greatest PR engines in the world, and controlling the message is very important. When they started to introduce terms like war, that automatically introduced terms like casualties. And so now, if you're over 70 or have an underlying health condition, are you actually just going to be a casualty of war? And thank you for your service is going to take on new meaning. It's interesting with synchronous communications, you know, how we have missed the opportunity to respond to the information. To me, from a pre-technology, pre-digital world, our response would have been slow, but also the spread would have been slow because of the exponential era we live in. So I'd like to understand from your perspective how, especially being in journalism, how communications is going to affect, or what are the possibilities going forward to alert people sooner, even with synchronous communications. Where do we go for a trust cornerstone, if you will, or touchstone?
Yeah, well, I don't believe the warfare analogy is at all relevant. Although France's President Emmanuel Macron used it as well, and it is an analogy that is very often used to convey to people the message of some urgency. And it has many downsides, and you pointed out quite brilliantly the main downside, which is somebody dying from a virus is not a casualty in a war against an enemy. It's just a sick person that died, and that could have been avoided. I believe that the closest analogy we can take is what we call in Europe the Spanish influenza of 1918 and 1919, which actually originated in China, though I would not know whether it was in Wuhan or not. And from China, it went to India and then to Europe. And I read that the death from the virus were more numerous.
Oh, we just lost you again, Gene. Hold on.
Is that I believe that I read that the dead from the virus of the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919 were more numerous than all the dead in World War I. But that is worldwide. In Europe, I believe very few people heard of the dead in China and India at the time. Honestly, I don't. Yes, the world went into lockdown much more fast than it could have been. I don't believe that communications is the problem. The problem is acceptance and the capacity of people and organizations to learn and learn fast. As we talk, I do not know if lockdown is the right solution. But I believe not lockdown is the unfairest solution.
John,
Devry?
I know we're getting close to our time here, and I want to make use of your expertise and your leadership with entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized businesses, because given our conversation, what I believe is happening here, especially in the last day, is a discussion around trade-offs between the economy and getting people back to work and addressing the virus. And so I was wondering if you had any insight or lessons to share around how the small and medium enterprises are faring, the business owners are faring in France and across Europe. And, you know, I know here many of my neighbors run small businesses, and in a week, these businesses have been completely shut down. So can you help us, you know, understand this trade-off and how that discussion is taking place in France, and any guidance for possibilities to have a discussion here?
Yeah, the French government put aside about 50 billion euros. That would be about the same number of dollars, just to help businesses through the lockdown. Most small businesses, shops and anything that had to do with the public has been closed down, and most entrepreneurs haven't the resources to pay for their personnel. So there is no disguising the fact that the consequences are going to be either very bad or terrible. Again, the European answer is...
You're on mute.
Yeah. You're on mute again? Okay, now you're
yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The European answer, but I believe it's being discussed in the American Senate as we speak, is to fund, to address public money to small businesses.
Yes.
So they can continue and not fire. The French state has been remarkably efficient in that, allowing companies to put their personnel into unemployment and taking up the salaries, so the personnel will not be fired. I believe that Americans have been fired in droves in the last few days, and facilitating credit and actually pouring public money to in the hands of entrepreneurs and small business owners.
It's something our previous guest on Friday, Joanna Mendelson, did mention this notion of safety nets, and the possibility, I think, maybe coming out of this too is to have a conversation in earnest about the types of safety nets that need to exist.
I don't want to be too much of a pessimist, Devry, here, but I think this should not disguise the fact that we're not going to come out of lockdown and everything will be the same again. Even if the lockdown lasts for only 4 or 6 weeks, you will have another month or two with delayed consumption starting, and business will look favorable again. But we were at the end of the longest expansion cycle, both financial and economic, that we have seen for an extremely long time, I believe, in the history of the American stock market in particular. This is not going, we're not going to say, oh, hello, let's start again. This is an external shock impacting the whole of the world economy, and that will very likely plunge the world economy into recession. On the other hand, it's just going to be a recession. Entrepreneurs and our economies have seen recessions and many recessions. So there's no reason to be unduly scared either by the pandemic, which is, of course, obviously, one dead is one dead too many, but it's not particular.
Oh, Jean, we just lost you again. Here, go ahead.
Is this good?
Yep, back again.
One dead is one dead too many. But this pandemic is not the plague, which could come back any moment as well, by the way. And this recession is not necessarily going to be the Great Depression. The real threat here, I believe, is not into the normal cycles of the economy, which the entrepreneurs and companies have weathered before. It's what we're going to do with fundamental liberties, which the markets and entrepreneurship need. I, from the outside, I'm very worried when I see the Earn It bill being discussed in, I believe, the Senate as well right now, and being attached to the coronavirus bill. I believe that China, in particular, used the pandemic to comfort and reinforce an authoritarian government. Going into something akin to a war economy will reinforce authoritarian tendencies the world over. How we go back from authoritarianism, necessary the authoritarianism, and how we go back to civil liberties, where and when, is an essential question, and it is an essential question for entrepreneurs as well. Because one of the tenets of Europe entrepreneurs, and I believe one quite obvious one, is that entrepreneurs need freedom and liberty to prosper. There is no business without it.
Jean, just very briefly, I was working on a project with a new intern yesterday on trying to measure social capital in different countries. And she asked me about the relationship of social capital and trust. And a new thought came to me that the kind of liberty and freedom you're talking about is really a function of decentralization. And it just struck me suddenly that decentralization can really only work when there is trust. And that it's the lack of trust that sets up a society for authoritarianism in various ways. But fundamentally, you can't trust people, the government can't trust people, so it's all done by rules and regulations. And people in America now are scared. And what if we lose trust?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hold on.
Do you? I don't trust my computer any longer. Do you?
That you can buy a new one. You can buy a new one, right?
I will. But the question is, do you trust the internet? Do we trust the internet? What the pandemic is doing is putting teleconferences such as ours and what we call in French télétravail, working through the internet at a distance in the center of the economy. The economy will change because people are not going to go back into the offices and taking hours of commuting so gladly for all the work they have been doing for weeks from their homes. The way to work will change. Elections, we had to cancel municipal elections in France last Sunday because of the pandemic. We'll have them again in June. There's no way about that. But do we trust the internet with voting? I believe that building a trustable internet, bringing trust into the digital economy is going to be the big issue of the coming years after the pandemic.
We're coming down to the last couple of minutes. Michael, do you have any thought on that? You're a guy who talks about building internets and digital and AI and stuff.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. We're not going back. The hybrids that will emerge will be built around, I think, to your point, trust corridors, places where people feel safe, they know they're safe. There's going to be probably a resurgence and emphasis on cybersecurity, business to business, person to person, more things like that where people feel safe. Years ago, in a book that I co-authored, we talked about access and the fact that you have to access information, aggregate it, analyze it, and act on it faster than anyone else in the world to be competitive. I think you're saying essentially the same thing about our response to this virus, but also part of that is the trust and character of the people that you're dealing with. And the internet, I think, is going to possibly not necessarily accelerate, but open the doors to more of those types of corridors where people like us would be in a room. There's a trust level there built on our character primarily that will probably enable us to do more and do it better. That's my hope on the other side of this is we get rid of a lot of the inefficiencies and some of the nonsense that goes with distrust and start building on more of the trust and character side.
Devry, a final thought?
I want to remark that the last two comments, Jean and Michael, really, I think, present us with the possibility. And so I want to say thank you, Jean, for motion this morning to be with us.
And I hope we soon will have all the chance to meet in person.
Oh, that
Thank
would be
you for
great.
inviting.
That would be really wonderful. That would be wonderful.